Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Soon your station will be here. And through the door of my compartment, the conductor announced, 10 minutes to go. Thank you, my good man. I picked up my valise and down the narrow corridor. While reading, sitting on the joints of the rails of the carriage, headed for the exit. The train slowed down. It jerked several times and finally, shrilly, with the wheels locking, came to a stop. The conductor wiped the handrails and helped me down the steep steps to the platform. The steam locomotive blew its whistle and the train shuddered. As you sang, an optical seizure began to slowly gain speed. Soon the last carriage disappeared around the corner. The clatter of the wheels ceased to be heard, and there was silence. I looked around. A small station, or rather, a half station, a wooden, in some places rotten platform, and a forest all around. I took out my watch and opened the lid. A quiet tune played. The time had long since passed 12 o'clock, and it was appropriate to think that evening would soon be upon us. I headed towards a small structure. Apparently, the station keeper's cabin. The door was locked. Everything about it said that trains rarely stopped here, and that the station master's position had long since been abolished for lack of use. I looked around, still not a soul in sight. To be honest, I felt a little creepy to be alone in an unfamiliar place. It was a rather dubious pleasure on the eve of evening. I walked around the cabin and saw an old inn going into the woods. Is there nothing to do? We must go. According to my calculations, the homestead should be somewhere about 5 kilometers from the railroad. After all, I have a revolver with me, and I'm not afraid of the nocturnal evil. I crossed myself and headed confidently toward the road, hitting the railroad embankment before heading deep into the woods. I stopped and pulled the revolver out of my valise, cranked the drum, checking the cartridges, and slipped the weapon behind my belt under my jacket. Well, can we go now? The inn was old, and it was obvious that it was rarely used. To the right and left grew tall mossy, spruce trees with their paws. There were pine trees all the way to the ground, but mostly I was surrounded by melnick. Elderberry bushes grew along the roadside, covered with bright red full berries. For some reason I remembered how as boys we used to spit unripe green berries through tubes, getting unimaginable pleasure from it. I imagined myself now with a buzina in my mouth, and it made me laugh. The road was mostly dry, but somewhere there were puddles, in some places quite large and deep. Sometimes there were boulders, brought here by the Olenek. They were neatly placed on the roadside, so as not to interfere with the passage. I looked under my feet for signs of hoofprints and wheels. There was no cart in sight. I walked not fast, swaying my valise in time with the movement of the evening. The sun was slowly but inevitably retreating behind the trees. The pace was getting darker and there was no end of the road in sight. I began to look around for a place to stay for the night. I was born into a poor family. My parents were once serfs of the Vyazemsky princes. My mother was brought up by the Baron and was brought up in the best noble traditions. In time, the Baron himself laid his eyes on her. But his wife was vigilant, and as soon as she saw his sympathy, immediately sold my future mother to a neighbor, and the latter married her to his coachman Kevin. And that's how my mother became Marlo Slaw. Being a woman of purpose and firm character, she managed to re-educate her husband, my father, taught him literacy, and made him study. After liberation, my father engaged in selling hemp and pine resin for his wife's dowry. And with his savings, he leased a large plot of forest, which once belonged to the same princes Vyazemsky. Gradually, the trade began to bear fruit. My father became a millionaire and owned several cargo steamships on the Dnieper. We had a big house outside the city and a large apartment in Street Petersburg. I was the only child in the family, and my mother, a former serf, prepared me for university. But I wanted to be in the military. By that time, the rules for entering a military school had been liberalized, and they started accepting non-oblomen. My father paid the right people, and for 2.5 years I became a junker at the Vilna Cavalry School. After graduation, I was sent in the rank of lieutenant to the Smith Hussar Regiment, which was going to the Caucasus. Well, in fact, do not send to war Cheyenne of a noble family, such served only in the Guards. In the first battle at the storming of the fortified Al-Zaitaq, I was wounded. I spent a long time in the hospital until I was dismissed from the army. But I had no sooner returned home, as I was summoned to one institution and offered to serve as an official. I must say that the new service did not interfere at all with my commercial activities. By the time I returned from the army, the Vyazemsky princes were completely impoverished. The baron's son Christopher started to trade, but quickly went bankrupt and mortgaged even the estate. His sister Lisa sat in her father's estate and, it seems, was preparing to become an old diva. There were no hunters for the young lady. Our house was not far from the prince's nest, and one evening, returning from hunting, I happened to see the young princess. I saw her and fell in love. I didn't chew the snot for a long time. A month later, I sent the matchmakers. You should have seen the old baron and his son. They seemed to burst with anger, if only a former slave, to marry their daughter. The blue blood even boiled. I was about to be chased away, but my father politely explained to the food gentleman that he would give a course to their bills of exchange, and if they did not pay their debts, the estate would come to me. This is a matter for zealous princes. The end of the debate was put by the princess. She, paying no attention to the relatives, gave her consent to marry me, knowing perfectly well that she was losing her title and nobility. A month later, we were married in a small church. A month later, I took my young wife and left for the capital of the empire. Now, allow me to introduce myself. Marlowe Stephen. I'm a salesman of all kinds of collections. Yes, that's my specialty. You might also call me an antiques dealer, but that's a bit of a stretch. I search for, buy out collections that have already been collected by someone, and then sell them to amateurs. Expertise, evaluation is all mine. Understandably, I try to buy cheaper and sell more expensive. The difference is my income, but I always try to give a real price. Cheating is not my thing. Collections, any postcards, paintings, watches antique and not antique bronze, cast iron, musical instruments, bells, anything a person can be passionate about and collect. Believe me, there are some very unusual collections. For example, a collection of feathers. It would seem a trifle. What could be interesting in it? Not at all. I recently sold such a collection to a street Petersburg object for very decent money. Or, for example, a collection of ships' helms and bells. I bought it from the widow of an old captain and sold it very profitably to a collector. He even almost fainted from happiness, so the money was not spared. I'm not talking about the gun collection. It's a gold mine, but I don't collect them myself. For me, it's only a trade item to be in the subject. I have to read scientific books and magazines, understand the types of iron casting, know the composition of ancient enamels and paints, be able to distinguish the original from the fake, sometimes very skillful. Some sellers go to all sorts of tricks and stratagems to sell their things more expensive, so you have to keep your eyes open. That night was no different from any other. Summer was fading, but it was still quite warm. Soon the cottagers would be back in town from their vacation, and my trade would be revitalized. I sat in front of the fireplace and smoked a cigar. I was leafing through a recent catalog from a Leipzig auction. As a rule, nothing of interest came up at these auctions, so a couple or three old canvases by unknown artists, some porcelain, and a covered green damsel, bronze. Complete collections of the subject of my commercial interest rarely pop up at these kinds of auctions. But this time I was interested in a small selection of jewelry, a few rings, necklaces, a couple of bracelets, white gold, and precious stones. In general, I do not like to fight at an auction, raising the bid to infinity. Generally, things are auctioned off to maximize profit. I don't know why I paid attention to the jeweler. I put aside the catalog and took the Jeller's Handbook off the shelf. On antique jewelry and articles is very often found branding with the assay. an ancient Russian measure of weight equal to 1/6 of a pound. The gold or silver content of an alloy is determined by the amount of Zlotnikov maximum 96. For example, 50. A 6 gold assay means that there are 56 parts of gold and 96 parts of the alloy. The remaining 40 additives, the so-called literature. Thus, pure metal without any impurities corresponded to 96 gold pieces of gold, 24 carats. It should be said that the presence of gold in the alloy forms the price of the product, plus the work of the craftsman and so on. It's a bit boring, of course, but agree, valuable information, and for lovers of antiques, and for specialists. So all the products presented in the catalog were 92 OU sample, which in itself was unusual. Budget jeweler is usually not higher. The 56th grading had salt in the fireplace at night, and soon I dozed off with a book dropped in my lap. I dreamed of the goldsmith, new samples, and a roundel round my head. I was awakened by a knock at the door. On the threshold stood a rather decently dressed gentleman with an expensive English cane hanging from the curve of his left arm. The man inclined his head politely and asked if I could see Mr. Marlowe. "What can I do for you?" I replied politely. "We could talk." The man nodded toward the open door. "If you mean business, I don't do business at home. Come by the store tomorrow." I was about to close the door, but the man stopped it with the toe of his lacquered shoe. "Believe me, Mr. Marlowe, what I'm about to tell you will interest you." The man looked me straight in the face, and there was something in his eyes that made me shy away. Letting him into the apartment, we went into the hall, and I nodded to the visitor on a vacant chair. "Would you like a cognac or a cigar?" I tried my best to hide my irritation. "Thank you. Let's get down to business." The stranger sat down in the chair, leaning against its arm. "Allow me to introduce myself. Sam Mr. Marlowe. I collect unusual sculptures. The means allow me to do so. They're not made of porcelain or metal. The object of my passion is human figures made of other materials, wax. For example, only wax can fully convey the beauty of the human body. All the more so now wax figures are becoming fashionable. But alas, wax figures do not last long. Even a simple change in air temperature can, if not destroy the figure, but to cause its noticeable damage. That's not the case with wood. Wooden sculptures can only be destroyed by fire, and if a wooden sculpture is properly treated, it can last forever. The stranger's eyes gleamed, reflecting the fire of the fireplace. "Do you want to sell me your collection?" I asked, blowing smoke out of my mouth. "No, I want to offer you to find something for me." "What do you mean?" My question sounded a little uncertain. "I want to ask you to visit Mr. Williams, or rather his estate. The fact is, the owner of the manor died recently, but I have information that he had a large collection of sculptures. There's no mention of it after his death, but it can't have just disappeared. You have to find it. I'll pay you good money." I could hear the excitement in the guest's voice. He was about to say something else. Lisa, my wife and assistant, entered the room. "Sorry, darling. I didn't know you were busy." She smiled sweetly. "Maybe bring an appetizer." Lisa nodded at the decanter of brandy. I looked questioningly at my guest. He smiled and shook his head negatively. "Thank you, dear. We'll be done soon." I did not introduce the guest to my wife. Lisa tilted her head, letting me know that she understood me, and quickly left the living room. "Where do you think this manor is located?" I returned to the conversation. "And what makes you think the collection still exists?" "I don't. I know. I was in Switzerland recently and saw a little girl's figure carved out of wood. It's from the Russian's collection. He was the only one who had figures like this. He showed me some in his St. Petersburg apartment. So you two know each other." I put the smoking cigar butt in the crystal ashtray. "Yes, casually. We crossed paths at an auction in Berlin. A year ago, he recognized me as a fellow countryman and invited me to visit his apartment in St. Petersburg. I took him up on that offer and stopped by. I fell in love with his collection. According to him, the main part of the collection is in his estate. It's about 100 kilometers along the Northwest Railroad. The manor is also called Elnick. The guest was rubbing his hands together with excitement. He asked the Russian if there were any hairs left or not. I took out a notebook. I don't know. According to him, he had a sister. She was living in this estate at the time. According to the Russian, she's a little out of sorts, shuns people, and doesn't like to socialize with them. She is a recluse. She is most likely the primary heir. We need to find the manor, check if there is a collection there, and persuade the sister to sell it. You can set the price. I'll do anything. The man was even freezing in his chair from excitement. In front of me lay the ancient city of Casimir, dissolved in the haze, or rather, what was left of it. I walked north for almost half a day through this ancient land. High hills sometimes, and dense forest now breathed. We know. I stood at the top of the tower and looked out at the thick new thickets outlining the tower and the ruins of the ancient city. In the distance, almost at the very horizon, I could see multicolored strips of already compressed fields, rye and wheat, orphaned by the wide stream leisurely carrying its waters. I cautiously descended to the ground and walked on a road not traveled in a long time. The day was coming to an end, and the heat was slowly beginning to subside in the grass. The grasshoppers awoke, and soon the air was filled with their cheerful rolling. Behind me, I heard the squeak of wheels and the whole not a horse. A cart surrounded by fresh hay was catching up with me. On the front sat a man overgrown, bearded to the ears, and lazily drove the horse to the oar, and carried a sledgehammer. "Is it something in a language I don't know?" he asked. I shrugged my shoulders, showing that I didn't understand anything. The man scratched his head, and after a bit of silence, said in pure Russian language, "Traveling baron." "You can say so," I replied with interest, looking at the raven of local places, looking for the estate of Mr. Russian. "There is one. It's about 20 versts away. You won't get there by nightfall. You'll have to spend the night somewhere." The man looked at me strangely. "Are you a baptized cross-bearer yourself?" "Of course I'm baptized." I pulled out a silver cross on a leather lace from under my shirt. "That's good. These places aren't well-to-do. It's better not to go at night." The charioteer crossed himself with some unfamiliar sign of the cross. "Where can we sleep here?" I asked. "Is there an inn nearby, do you think?" "Just by Perrin's ferry crossing. The Armenians crossed the river during the party. It's not far from there." The man grinned. "Sit down, sir. What's the use of beating your legs for nothing?" He fucked Gemma, and the horse trotted off. We passed the ruins of the city, and the road looped between the hills again. We rode in silence. The charioteer knew what he wanted and silently smoked a duck and an assad. I leaned back on the soft, fragrant hay and dozed off to the sound of the wheels. I woke up when the wheels stopped beating. The cart stood in front of a wide rubrail of ship's pine from the battle. Here was the charioteer squirming. He smiled broadly and waved his hand as if inviting me in. I got off the carts and the lull of the legs, and with interest began to look at the unusual shapes of the house, more like an ancient terem. I looked back at the massive iron-striped gate under a high frame. Just in front of them stood an ancient copper cannon aimed at the steamer. Strange. For what purpose? Inside we were greeted by a white, red-cheeked, and full of piles hostess. Smelled of hot samovar and bread. "Who is it you've brought?" "Charles." She smiled with a full mouth, scrutinizing me with a supple look. "Yes, here is the Baron of the Russian manor looking for him. He won't get there before dark, so accept a stay until morning." I inclined my head politely. "Come in, sir." The hostess's voice became viscously sweet, like overripe honey. I looked around. There were several tables in the hall. 3 men in the corner were drinking tea from a samovar with 3 pieces of sugar. Over the table hung a lively chatter in an unfamiliar language. They paid not the slightest attention to me. I sat down at a table covered with snow-white tablecloth, nodded to my traveling companion. "I invite you to join the company." My companion, while with pleasure, took off the con mascara and nestled it on a nail hammered into the wall, and went to the counter to order tea and snacks for the table. It was almost dark, and kerosene lamps were burning in the hall, creating a mysterious twilight, chipped with shadows. Above our table, too, the kerosene lamp was lit, shining in the shui with a flower as round as a large margarita of fire. Soon the hostess brought a tall white teapot and 2 coolly perky Seraphan cups. Next on the wheat table, somehow by magic, there was a stock and a decanter. While about something, I looked around the room. The walls of the hall, at first glance, seemed to me extensive oak panels. But then I saw that they were perfectly matched pine logs. They were waxed and had a special amber color. Judging by the quality of the woodwork, it had been done skillfully and lovingly for centuries. I imagined for a second how much time and effort such quality work took. Right in front of me on the wall hung several ancient wooden shields with iron booms and leather plates. Most of them were covered with red and black paint already rubbed off. Between the shields on the carpets hung large and small axes, swords, muzzles, ancient daggers, and outlandish knives. Oh, and God knows what else. The soft thief of carpets emphasized the elegance of forms and the hidden strength of fatigue. All this household, despite its antiquity, was well cleaned and oiled. What struck me as a lover of antiquities was the excellent cachet of all these rarities. It seemed that swords, axes, had only yesterday been plucked out by the smith of the armorers. On the adjoining wall hung several unusual musical instruments, some very similar to guitar, others of exotic appearance, not like violins or some kind of snags with strings and bounces. A couple of bear skins and a few antlers weighed in. All in all, it all gave the hall an old cozy look. I even felt like I was somewhere in the 9th century instead of the last 1915. While I was looking around the room, on the table, on the tray was already lying minced meat and even duck covered with forbidden apples, dumping night jam nearby on a variety of plates and spoons. Salted mushrooms by the gun with garlic, boiled potatoes, and pate were frolicking. Almost transparent slices of ham were served separately. Wild boar, well smoked and cross-cut. As soon as Charles was seated at my table, the hostess brought out a dispersed charcuterie on a tray, in a large pewter shot glass, splashing some creepy liquid with the aroma of mint and something unfamiliar. "Try it, Baron," Charles smiled. "You've never had this before." I followed him and put the shot glass in my mouth. The liquid burned my gut for a moment and was quickly confused by the elderly. Tears splashed from my eyes, but I restrained myself and did not blush. But as the hostess looked at me with curiosity, what is it only I could pronounce, translating the spirit brewed by an ancient recipe only for dear guests, the hostess nodded at the birch sap of 100 herbs, and the dishes kept arriving. On the table appeared clay, potted with pickled moose, lips in under vinegar, my large wooden bowl of sauerkraut and pickles. Finally, the hostess personally placed a tin bowl on the table on which thinly sliced pieces of pie lay in a neat mound, made by mega important cookie brains. Charles filled the cooling shot glasses with vodka and proclaimed a toast: "To be good to the court and alive for good luck." I didn't understand everything in this toast, but I dutifully drank. We had a snack, and Charles took out a tape about a raven, twisted a gypsy, and bought from a lamp. Satisfied, let out a line of smoke. "And what is it alive?" "As if, by the way," I asked. "You'll soon see for yourself," Charles grinned. We had been sitting for more than an hour when an old wolfish man with no arms entered the hall. Having signed a little at the entrance, he took down from the wall an instrument remotely resembling a violin. Soon a loud melody floated through the hall. It was unlike anything I'd heard before: ragged rips, notes, squeaks, clouds, a sound that penetrated all the way to the heart. The music seemed like aliens from another world, of a world where non-humans ruled the ball. The melody lashed across the floor, then went up under the roof, striving to break free. Finally, it succeeded, and it soared into the starry sky, straight to the golden chariot, the serpent, the god, the foot that began its flight into the coming dawn. The ancient music, played in these parts for 1,000 years, awakened vague and unfamiliar images in my mind that I had not suspected an hour ago. The hostess brought out a large wooden bowl and poured milk. The old man stopped playing and quietly tapped the floor with his staff. Knock, 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 knock. He stood for a while and knocked again. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of some movement from the dark corners of the plate. Snakes slowly crawled to the plate in unmanned shadows. I shuddered involuntarily. The very sight of creeping of warring creatures gave me a primal terror. I was about to rush to the exit, but he intercepted me by the arm. I froze and, afraid to move, stared at the tangle of snakes near the plate of milk. Suddenly, I felt something cold and slippery crawling up my leg. The head of a snake appeared above the table. It froze motionless as if taking in, occasionally showing its twin tongues, then crawled onto my lap and then onto the table. It grabbed from my plate a piece of meat and immediately swallowed. Now everyone in the room, or our table. The snake looked at me for some time with a non-running look, and then also leisurely descended to the floor on my leg and crawled to the plate. About 20 minutes passed, and the snakes slowly began to spread to the corners. People started talking in the hall again, and servants started running around. I sat in shock, unable to say a word. At last he managed to pour a shot of vodka into my mouth. He seemed to be frightened and surprised himself when we more or less came to our senses. My traveling companion said, "I have lived a long time, but this is the first time I have seen such a thing." Charles shook his head at the idea of the living embracing a man. Suddenly the old man, still standing at the entrance, looked in our direction. "To my head here alive. And to whom are they feet?" he said in a suddenly thick bass, tapped his staff, and walked out the door. What did he say? I looked at my neighbor. "The Serpentine was born tonight," the king said Charles fearfully, and looked at his mistress with a long, expressive look. It was already night outside the window. When I stood in the gate, there was a knocking in the courtyard. Well, knocked. That's a weak word. In the gate nails or something heavy, with Hilda's throat open loudly. Even from where I was standing, I could see the landlady turn pale and shudder. She nodded, and one of her servants ran to open the gate. A moment later, the stomping of horses' hooves sounded in the courtyard, and several men came in through the swinging doors, though it was not cold outside. They were dressed in cloaks made of wolf skins, wool on the outside. No weapons in sight, but long daggers were guessed under the squares. I knew that for local men a dagger is a mandatory attribute as a stone in the Caucasus. The newly arrived threw off their clothes and their arms under the running servants and sat down rankly at the free table on the benches. The hostess and the servants bustled around, arranging the utensils and dishes on the table. Soon the wine was sick in the parks, and the voices of the guests became louder. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the few visitors leaving the hall. Charles, too, disappeared as if vaporized. I, on the other hand, remained at my table. We ate the pie with pleasure and occasionally had a shot of vodka. Soon, I and later guests were left in the hall. The doors banged again, and a young lady entered the room. Her appearance was greeted with loud squawks. "Cindy, what's taking you so long?" They shouted for the hops and the young men. "Come and sit down with us." They quickly made room for their guest and moved her a wine glass. The maiden drained it in one fell swoop and looked curiously in my direction. I tried to ignore the merry company. I looked for my mistress with my eyes. "Going to go to bed?" "Pan missus," sounded a melodious voice right above my ear. I looked up. Opposite my table stood a long-time maiden and smiled. "May I have a glass of wine with you?" She unceremoniously sat down on the bench. Across from me emerged from the darkness. The servant served her a full glass of red wine. I poured myself some vodka. The girl barely touched my shot glass with her glass and leisurely drained it to the bottom. I drank a little and put the shot glass on the table. Pan is squeamish about drinking with me, quite loudly, unhappily said the maiden. He took me for a slutty girl. I already knew where this was going, and threw a quick glance at the opposite wall. Then I moved my valise toward me and opened it. My revolver was on the top of it, and it was a matter of seconds to get it out quickly. The room grew quiet. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement at a neighboring table and heard heavy footsteps. Raven, that insolent, insulted me with a nasty voice, spelled the girl, hiding behind the broad back of her defender. Pan knows what awaits him for insulting a lady. The scowling man spoke in a thick bass, putting his right hand on the hilt of his dagger. I involuntarily noticed the rings, thickly applied to his fingers. Provincial ponce. I stand up. Please forgive me if I have unwittingly offended you and yours. I've been here a long time, and I've had enough to drink. With your permission, I'm going to bed. I tried to speak peacefully, though I knew from experience that it would do little good in my situation. Mr. Nobleman. The man spoke again. No, I smirked. That makes things easier. Now, I'll teach you how to talk to a lady. You're an asshole. Then he threw back the floor of his green lightweight captain's jacket and pulled out a whip from behind his girdle. I was still trying to dodge the contraction by appealing to the voice of reason, but in vain. The presence of an infantile Menka and Hop in my head were doing their job. Pans decided to make fun of a stranger, to dispel, so to speak, boredom. Well done. He swung, going to hit me in the face with the whip, but I took a step to the side and shoved the offender with the palm of my hand. He couldn't stay on his feet and fell on his ass. The girl kicked out of the table and two men came up and rushed toward me. But I was already pulling a sword with a ravenous, narrow blade from the wall. I didn't dance or make glamorous paw with my sword. I just rushed in front of the two men who were running towards me and struck one of them in the face with the blade. He stumbled and fell to the floor. I met the other with a blow of my right hand, holding the hilt, and I could hear the bones of his nose cracking. On my left, a small man with a weighty club in his hand rushed at me. I didn't like to start with him, lunged and punctured his arm. He howled and was no longer interested in me. Meanwhile, the maiden who had been lying continuously all this time helped the first one out of the door. That one snatched up a long dagger and, putting forward his right hand, rushed at me. I was busy with the servant and missed the moment. "Look out!" my mistress shouted to me, and I had time to turn around with a swift swing of my sword. The dagger fell from my assailant's hand, and then I was out of the way. A right straight punch to the jaw knocked the guy to the ground. I kicked him a few times, trying with the toe of my boot to mess up his face. If on the Grandee's Pawnee no longer ran, she sat silently, hammered in a corner, and watched the bloody fight with fear. Finally, the brawlers calmed down. 3 bodies lay motionless on the floor. The very first one was slightly underfoot. A servant sat by the column, clasping his bleeding hand with his hand. I stood motionless, holding the hilt of the sword in my palm. The light of the oil lamp reflected on its tip, gleaming predatorily. For a second, it seemed to me that death itself was dancing on my knee. Unforgiving and ruthless on the battlefield remained behind me. Thank you, Monsieur Lefort, for the lesson. Old Norman wrestling. That was very helpful. Not for nothing did I devote so much time to it at the Junkers School. Good blade, I said respectfully, and wiped the blade. And the white shirt to the servant then returned the weapon to its place. I turned to the hostess. She understood me without words and herself filled my glass with elm. I tipped the scalding drink into my mouth and picked up my valise. Carefully, I stepped over the pans that had fallen silent on the floor. Show me to my room. I turned to the landlady. She took the kerosene, a new lamp, and without saying anything went to the stairs leading to the second floor. The day began, as usual, with an all-consuming boredom. Putting on a robe after a nap. Lisa had a cup of coffee in the dining room. At that time, the clock struck 12. It was time to get ready for lunch. Lisa yawned and with a bronze knife began to cut up the fancy French magazine delivered the night before. But no sooner had she cut the first page than the doorbell rang. A minute later, she was told that her brother Christopher and his companion had arrived. Without knowing why, Lisa was delighted at her brother's unexpected visit, especially with a mate after marrying Stephen. Brother and sister did not see each other often. Christopher avoided her husband in every way possible, considering it beneath his dignity to consort with some old box, especially since Stephen was not a nobleman and was clearly not fit for husband's Bukvayazemskaya. After the wedding, Lisa moved with her husband to the capital in his apartment. She felt that Stephen loved her. He pampered her in every possible way, bought expensive jewelry, dressed in the latest fashion, took her to theaters and galleries. Everything was fine at first sight, but it was only at first sight. Lisa caught on herself sympathetic, contemptuous looks of others. How could she, a born princess, sacrifice her nobility and title for the sake of her husband? Raznochency, former serf. Not that it hurt her much, but still one had to admit it was unpleasant. And most of all, boredom. She didn't know what to do. She was going to study, but then she changed her mind. Lisa was educated. Her background gave her certain advantages. She had even graduated from the Smolny Institute, but it was difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to find a use for her talents in the empire. True, there was a way to give birth to Stephen children and take care of them. But something kept Lisa from taking that step, as if she were not quite finished. Surely she and Stephen would live together until they were old. Stephen had been gone for almost a week now, and Lisa did not know when her husband would return. She looked longingly at her watch and sighed heavily. Just then Christopher entered the living room. He was accompanied by a dapper young man dressed in a gray tee with a mustache. He was of the type that ladies like so much. Lisa noticed this at once and smiled to herself. "Hello, my soul." Christopher kissed his sister on the cheek. "Let me introduce you to my old friend Sebastian. He returned from London yesterday and is full of impressions. Sebastian, this is my sister Lisa." Christopher tilted his head. Sebastian took Lisa's outstretched palm with cold fingers and touched it lightly with his lips. "Where's your miser, grandmother?" All with the old man. Christopher's voice was full of contempt. "Christopher, please." Lisa looked at her brother reproachfully. "Stephen has been away on business for a week." "That's fine. Sebastian invites us to the Mikhailovsky Theater. The French are doing Traviata tonight. But then to the Metropole restaurant. Sophia is singing there tonight with a gypsy corps. It's wonderful. It's so good. And then there will be some exotic dances only for our own people." The maid came in and began to set out the coffee utensils, but the guests categorically refused coffee, citing urgent business. Christopher promised to pick up the visa at 18 o'clock. That was the end of it. Lisa finally unfolded the magazine, but she couldn't read it. Sebastian's face loomed before her eyes. Lisa chased away the thought, inappropriate for a married woman. But she couldn't help herself. She knew one thing for sure. She liked Sebastian. The upcoming evening made her dizzy, and Lisa hummed to herself and began to try on her evening gown. The opera was wonderful. As always, was at the top of her game. The audience applauded for a long time and did not want to let her go after the performance. Lisa and her companions got into their own Sebastian carriage and went to the Metropole. By the time they arrived, the restaurant was full, but Sebastian had booked a table in advance. After a while, their company was joined by herself. She kissed Christopher playfully, gave Sebastian a friendly nod, and smiled at Lisa. Everything that was happening made her dizzy. It was a charming evening, and Sebastian seemed like a true English gentleman. "You have a very delicate nature," he whispered in Lisa's ear as he refilled her glass of red wine. Lisa was pleased by the young man's attention. She nodded and smiled at the corner of her lips. "Do you have such an expressive face, like in old Italian paintings?" The intrusive bow didn't stop. "Any artist would be happy to paint your portrait. Just a face." Unexpectedly, with coquettish Lisa, Sebastian was embarrassed for a moment, then began complimenting her with even more fervor. The gypsies sang and danced, and a young lady in bow came on stage. They held hands and froze in anticipation of the music. A guitar played and the dance began. The music was unusual, but extremely passionate. So was the dance. The partners moved quickly on the stage in a single impulse. It seemed that love and passion were about to engulf them both. The guitar played louder. It was joined by another music, then hushed, then played loudly. Finally, the partner surrendered and threw herself on her beau's arm. The hall exploded with applause. "What is the name of this dance?" Lisa asked with a gasp. "Tango." Sebastian replied condescendingly. "Soon it will conquer the whole of Europe." By the end of the evening, Lisa was already quite tipsy, and when Sebastian offered to see his collection of bronzes brought from England, she unexpectedly agreed. She was back in her familiar environment. She revolved among the nobility and bohemians, and therefore saw nothing criminal in going to see the collection of statuettes of a young man hitherto unknown to her, especially when accompanied by her brother and his companion. Sebastian lived in a spacious apartment in Schmidt's house, almost in the very center of St. Petersburg. They all sat for a while longer, drinking a bottle of old French wine. Then, after coffee, Christopher discreetly disappeared with his girlfriend into one of the rooms. The wine was drunk and the atmosphere cozy. Pushed to madness, Lisa never fully realized how she had ended up in Sebastian's bed, staring intently into his eyes. She gave herself without foreplay, and only when she felt him inside her. She remembered Stephen, but after a few sweet moments, she forgot again. Responding to his caresses, she sensed that Sebastian had a lot of experience with women. When he entered, she felt a hot warmth spill over her body. She felt so good with him that she soon. Lisa wanted nothing more. She wanted it to continue indefinitely. In the morning, remorse came over her. With her mind, she realized that she had cynically betrayed her husband that night. But she felt so good that she didn't want to leave her new acquaintance. Then Christopher appeared with his mistress, and they had fun again, forgetting everything. Several times Lisa caught a rather smirking grin from her brother. Lisa did not return home until the next day, consumed by passion. She had not even considered that Stephen might have returned. After a few years of quiet, measured life with her husband, Lisa felt happy and so desirable. She felt no particular remorse. I just didn't know what to do next, whether to end the relationship with Sebastian immediately or, on the contrary, to continue it. She did not consider the time spent in her lover's bed to be cheating. Lisa was not going to leave her husband. Well, regretted a little, not washed off. She continued to love Stephen, and even wanted to have children with him. Or she did, but not with him. She was quite satisfied with a secure life with her husband, his calm, non-fanatical love. But Sebastian's heart was sweetly flooded and butterflies fluttered in her stomach. Sebastian, before going to bed, he would walk around the room completely naked for a while, giving Lisa the opportunity to admire his body, completely confident in its beauty. And then it was back to kissing, thrusting, and she would dive headfirst into the hot waves of pleasure. I woke up to a quiet knock at the door. "Get up," Baron heard the soft voice of the landlady. I jumped out of bed, noting the valise next to the bed. I opened it with a jerk and made sure that the revolver was still there. I dressed quickly and went downstairs to the hall. There were no traces of last night's battle. The floor was cleanly washed. There was breakfast on the corner table. I ate quickly and paid. I thought for a while and put a nickel on top. "For your trouble." When I kissed the hospitable hostess's hand and headed for the door, she called out to me, "Mr. Marlowe, do I have a present for you?" She picked up a cane standing in the corner and held it out to me. "It will be easier for you with it." I took a separate bronze-weighted stick and hung it on my arm. The hostess looked at me with a grin. Suddenly, I understood everything. With my hand, I touched the handle in the shape of Rosinu Snake's mouth and turned it gently. In a moment, a rather wide blade appeared in my hand, gleamed predatorily. In the light of the sunbeam, it was brought by my late husband, but he did not have time to use it. Tears glistened in the eyes of my hostess. "Have a safe journey. Take care. I'll pray for you." She kissed me on the cheek and baptized me with the sign of the cross. Charles was waiting for me in the yard, sitting on the front of the cart. He looked as if nothing had happened, smiled welcomingly at me smoking his duck. "It's time to go. Baron, we'll be there by lunchtime." Gray-haired Charles picked up the reins. I put my valise on the cart. The cart was lined with fresh hay, covered with a cloth-colored blanket. While I was getting settled, did the man make a face at the squeak? The wagon moved off. It was not so hot today. Soon the road slid into the woods, and it was even a little cooler. The fluffy business paws formed a kind of pollock over the forest inn. The sun's rays hardly broke through the thick needles, and soon dusk enveloped the whole place. At one point, it seemed to me that once the train all the way to the ground spruce trees were about to close around us forever, shutting out the sun in my soul, slowly began to rise unrecognized, sitting in the very depths of consciousness, primal fear of the forest. I even cocked my head a few times, as if I wanted to ward it off. This obsession. Charles from the mountains, who had killed, sat on the front of the cart, and from time to time, as if reluctantly, drove the reins of the sadly coming horse. I lay down on the summer-smelling hay, putting my valise under my head, and watched the decayed and spruce trees slowly floating by. The cart bounced sharply. It hit a bump. The forest road narrowed noticeably. The paws of spruce trees were already clinging to the sides of the cart. Like the hands of ghouls, Charles smoked his stinking duck unperturbed. "This place is a death trap. All sorts of creatures." Suddenly he spoke. I looked around involuntarily. If there was a forest undead here before, it hasn't gone anywhere. So it lives among timid swamps and in thick, impenetrable groves. "There's a lot to see here." As if reading my thoughts, Charles said, "Don't take off your cross." I involuntarily fumbled for the silver cross hanging on a chain under my clothes. The cart ran on buds and roots protruding from the ground. Finally, we came to the edge of a rather large clearing. At its edge stood a large one-story wooden house surrounded by a metal fence. It had now slipped and fallen down in places. It was obvious that the estate was missing its owner's hand. There was a smell of smoke mixed with the odor of water. Well, here we are. This is the Russian's estate. It's not a nice place. Nothing but swamps. Charles crossed himself. "Goodbye, Baron. Maybe I'll see you again sometime." I took out some money to pay the freedman, but Charles shook his head negatively. He quickly turned the wagon around in the cart, bouncing on kidneys, disappeared into the woods. A moment later, the pitiful neighing of a horse reached me. The next morning, Sebastian sent Lisa a huge bouquet of red roses, and she couldn't resist. She spent the night in his arms again. The vicious liaison was addictive. Lisa spent almost all her evenings with her lover, almost always staying overnight. At some point, she realized it wasn't love. Lisa was sure she would not trade her husband for a lover. Every time she got into the carriage sent for her, Lisa convinced herself that it was the last time. But she couldn't help herself. So she went to see her lover again and again. "What could you possibly have in common with this junk in your cheeks, kissing a young woman?" Sebastian asked. "This is a man not of our circle. Living with him will defame you and your family. Don't forget, you are a born Princess Vyazemskaya. Stay with me, and I'll throw the whole world at your feet. You'll be what you should be again." Passion surrounded the head of Lise. I didn't feel like talking. She only pressed her lover's head more tightly to her breast, giving her whole body and soul to his caresses. A week passed from Stephen. There had been no news. Despite the adventures of love, Lisa's heart was troubled, and Sebastian was becoming more and more insistent. He was already jealous of her husband, and Christopher was adding fuel to the fire. "What do you want?" "It's a good match. A rich, intelligent nobleman. Give up your miser, saber, and take your place in society again." He persisted in persuading his sister, take his money and move in with Sebastian. But it's indecent. Stephen is my husband. Lysa weakly resisted, realizing with her mind that there was a rational grain in her brother's proposal, especially since Sebastian is so sweet. But when her lover presented Lysa with a gold and diamond necklace, she trembled with her brother's help. Lysa opened the safe in her husband's office, took all the cash and bank bearer bonds. With almost 5,000, she packed up her belongings and moved in with Sebastian. Not a week had passed since Stephen's departure. Meanwhile, taking my valise in my left hand and keeping my cane in my right, I made my way toward the miraculously surviving drama. As I approached, looking more closely at the bar house, the ordinary large house gradually over the decades took on the features of a typical mansion typical of the northwestern region. One story with a roof island and attic with boarded-up windows. A handsome, carved, oak door and leather iron lanterns hung on either side of the front entrance above the entrance itself, painted portico supported by 4 antique-style columns, which gave the house itself a certain playfulness and frivolity. But despite the mix of architectural styles, the house inspired an unmotivated fear. Its seemingly frivolous architectural excesses not only did not soften this impression, but instead gave the house an inexplicable gloominess and mystery. I was unfamiliar with this architectural style peculiar to these gloomy, swampy woods. Behind the house stretched a dense business forest stretching for many kilometers. The front was closely adjoined by an old neglected park, in which once well-kept fruit trees protruded from yellowed weeds, spreading their branches like Black Oscar's evil hands. The facade of the mansion. There was that painted in yellow-green color the light of bureaucratic boredom, and about that vividly creepy. However, from painting little remained, as the plaster mostly fell off. Survived triangular gables and above the windows, whose Renaissance austerity has been softened, and the plaster wigs are tall. The narrow 3 or 4 windows reminded me of the end of history and the former greatness of the owners, leaning lightly on a cane. I approached the front doors at the entrance. Suddenly, a sense of inexplicable danger made me look back. Right behind my back, about 3 meters away, pinning his ears and menacingly here motionless, froze a huge gray wolf. He didn't make a sound, only not dog-like lower his fluffy tail to his hind legs. His fierce, non-running gaze on his bloodshot eyes held me as if in its crosshairs. "Who is it?" An unexpected voice in the silence brought me out of my daze. Trying not to make any sudden movements, I slowly turned around. On the stone porch stood a gray-haired old man, clutching a long antique shotgun pointed at me. It was clear that it was loaded, as there was a smoking wick in his left hand, which he held down with his thumb. He had a rather brave appearance, a tanned, wrinkled face, on his head, on a genuine white wig, thin, taut in the room, tied with a wide belt, similar to Slutsky's on legs spread apart, soft, brown boots with busy upward noses. Grandfather, in spite of his tender age, held a rifle, very confidently ready to fire at any moment from such a distance it was impossible to miss. I set the valise down carefully and held up my hands. "Don't shoot. I am from Street Petersburg. I have business with your mistress." I tried to speak smoothly, so as not to frighten the old soldier. The old man was silent, apparently trying to decide what to do. I smiled. "My name is Stephen Marlowe. Report me to Mrs. Russian." My voice was sweeter than honey. "There is no Mistress Ruska Jadwiga here. The mistress of this manor." Importantly, said the old man in Russian, her brother. I was relieved. It seemed I had come to the right place. Now it was very important to meet with the mistress and learn from her about the fate of the collection. The old man grabbed his gun and disappeared out the door. I turned my head. The wolf was still standing behind my back, keeping his yellow eyes on me. Finally, the door opened again and the same old man appeared on the porch, but this time without a gun. "Pani Jadwiga asked you to come through." The old man opened the door, letting me into the house. Elegantly bowing my head and crossing the threshold, I looked back. The wolf was gone. I looked up, head and looked up at the piercing blue sky with white clouds. And the blue sun hangs in the sky for a long time, as if it doesn't want to give up its rights to the night. But then, as if realizing, it instantly disappears and darkness falls on the earth. I climbed up to the voyage and stepped inside the house, the musty air of old age and decay. It hit me in the face. I looked around. A spacious hallway of its own size, more like a dance hall. A wooden staircase leading up to the attics. In the right corner of the hall, a large fireplace made of wild stone, which was brought to these places 1,000 years ago by a glacier. It was obvious that the fire had recently been lit on the walls of the temples with ancient paintings by long-forgotten artists, mixed with hunting trophies. The horns of skull heads of animals, hunted at different times, were placed on special medallions covered with black lacquer. From time, the lacquer in some places was drawn and crumbled, which gave the interior some sinister part. From the ceiling on chains, from the paddle, a huge bronze chandelier with lice, a gorocomb of candles, like the fireplace. It too had been recently lit. A bit of furniture, worn, upholstered, and an ebony table completed the interior. From the hall to the depths of the house led several doors, and I stopped in indecision. What can I do for the gentleman? An elderly lady, accompanied by a young maiden, came out to meet me. Allow me to introduce myself. Marlowe Stephen the antiquary. I bowed my head. I have business with you. We could talk in private. I did not want to start a serious conversation on the fly in the presence of a stranger, especially since I recognized in the girl the very drunkenness for which I got into a fight with the local Don Juan. Judging by the sparkling eyes, the girl also recognized me, but she tried not to show it. I have no secrets from my niece. The lady threw her head down angrily. Cindy, make us some coffee. Let's go into the living room. The hostess made an inviting gesture and headed for one of the doors. We were seated in the large room at a round table. Cindy brought a tray from the coffee pot and cups and poured the coffee. I took a sip out of politeness and marveled. The coffee was very good. So what business do you have with me? The hostess said dryly and looked me in the eye. I outlined the essence of the matter, telling about a favorable deal on the sale of the collection. I was ready to pay the money right now in gold or assignats. I was trying to say something else when the landlady stopped me. My brother spent his life wandering the world, collecting his vile collection. God punished him for it by giving him a disease that killed him. He left behind Cindy, his daughter. Who the mother is, I don't know. That's another of his sins. I looked at the Japanese woman. She had her head down, and was not at all like the unleashed maiden I had seen in the cards. I have burned this lewd gathering so that it will not tempt anyone, continued the hostess. That will be all, Mr. Marlowe. I think the matter is over. It's too late to spend the night at the manor. Tomorrow Jack will take you to the nearest whiskey. She got up and left without saying goodbye, followed by Cindy. After a quick glance at me, Jack, who acted as a watchman and footman, led me into a room that had apparently been a study. A desk, an armchair, a sofa against the wall, and a fireplace. Above the sofa was a portrait of a beautiful young woman in a dress with letters. I did not want to go to bed and decided to spend the night on the sofa. I put my valise at the headboard, put my revolver under the pillow, and placed my cane next to it. God protects the wiser. I was already asleep when there was a knock at the door. Jack brought supper. A long tablecloth, white on starch, was tentatively set on the table. As if by magic, even bowls of sauerkraut, pickles, and pickled breasts appeared, separated by a footman. A bowl of raw eggs on a small plate lay neatly on a reasonable lard with a solid meat layer. Finally, a hot cast iron with stew, potatoes, and a wonderful one appeared on the table. Jack went out and quickly returned with a Countess Wild cold vodka. Here now the still life could be considered finished while I ate. It was already getting dark. The sun was hidden behind a reasonable fence from the tops of fir trees immediately pulled cold. Autumn was inexorably taking its toll. Jack. He melted the fireplace and said good night to me. Having settled down on the sofa, I drank vodka. Pleasant warmth began to develop slowly. Moonlight penetrated into the room through the long-ago unwashed window, leaving a light path on the floor and wall. I closed my eyes. The events of the past day raced through my head, keeping me awake. I lay blissfully awake. All over my body was paying out, sweet from home. For the first time in ages, I felt calm and peaceful. I glanced at my watch in the not-too-bright glow of the eternal flame. The hand showed 22 o'clock, early by city standards. But here in the forest wilderness, it was late night. Life surrounded by wild, untouched nature seemed to me clear and simple. One should get up at dawn, go hunting, fishing for mushrooms, have dinner in the evening, and go to bed early. Forest swamps, gun, fire, lack of stress, and a healthy lifestyle contribute to longevity. I envy the people who live here. I'd give up everything to live here in the middle of nowhere and live out my life in peace and quiet. I thought, falling asleep. I didn't understand why I woke up. I lay there for a few minutes, pondered where I then opened my eyes. The candle was burning and went out, but the room was quite bright from the color of the full moon streaming through the window. Suddenly, a distinctive sound came from the hallway, slamming the door. I sat up and took the revolver in my hand. What is it? Without putting on my boots, I went to the door and listened. Someone was walking slowly down the hall. Could it be Jack going around the house? Acting as watchman or landlady, unable to sleep, snapped loudly, and the sound of footsteps came closer and closer. I opened the door slightly. I could clearly see a part of the corridor, dedicated by moonlight. Well could be heard. Footsteps clinked together, but I couldn't see anyone. I began to feel uneasy. It was damned funny. From outside, the faint but distinct barking of a dog reached me. I went back to the window and looked down, but I couldn't see anyone, no matter how hard I tried. As soon as I heard that barking, goosebumps ran down my spine. Even now, years later, it's hard for me to say why I reacted the way I did to an ordinary dog barking. But back then, in the house, I only gripped the grip of my revolver tighter. I listened. The footsteps died away, and I suddenly realized that there was someone or something at the door. And somehow I was sure that something terrible was waiting for me. Trying to make as little noise as possible, I slowly cocked the trigger with my thumb, cautiously approached the door, and then swung it open. Meanwhile, life together with Sebastian Lisa seemed like paradise at first. She bathed in his love, paying little attention to what was going on around the money, actually stolen from her husband. She gave it to Christopher for safekeeping. He lucidly explained to Lisa that it would be more secure with him. But after a while, Lisa began to feel a guilty conscience. She was worried that she had been so mean to Stephen, abandoning and robbing her own husband. It wasn't easy to get it out of her head. She tried to forget herself in unrestrained merriment, but the black thoughts came back to her and kept her awake, especially at night. Sebastian and Christopher told Lisa about the bright prospects of the near future. Sebastian suggested going to the church court and asking for permission to hear, but Lisa realized that her chances of becoming a free woman were very slim. True, there was one catch. If she could accuse her husband of adultery, even the church court could rule favorably on her case. When she had spoken to Sebastian about it, he had grasped at that straw with enthusiasm. It was only a matter of finding bride witnesses and filing for divorce. At the same time, Lisa and her brother decided to petition the emperor for the return of Lisa, title, and nobility. Her husband had taken advantage of her family's plight and almost forcibly married her. Here, too, there was hope that all would turn out well. In the meantime, Lisa and her friends continued to spend Stephen's money without denying themselves anything. But no matter how much Lisa tried to forget herself, she waited with fear for her husband's return, realizing that under the law of the empire, he had every right to forcibly bring her home. One evening, as she and Sebastian drank a bottle of Chateau Renault, Lisa asked her lover what they would do if the courts didn't work out. Sebastian thought for a moment, then said, I have good connections with the social revolutionaries. They're quiet now, but I can make arrangements with the right people, and your Stephen will be gone in one fell swoop." Lisa shuddered at these words, but her status as a widow promised her tantalizing prospects. Giving her access to Stephen's main money, she wiped away her tears and smiled blissfully. Meanwhile, I cautiously approached the door and then swung it open sharply. No one was there. I only felt a slight breeze blowing in. Without letting go of my weapon, I stepped out into the hallway and made my way down the hall. All was quiet. There was something lying on the bottom step of the stairs leading to the attic. I bent down and gingerly picked up a small object, a small spearhead made of white metal, most likely silver. It had a leather lanyard on it. It was an amulet. Apparently, it had once adorned the chest of a warrior. The amulet was made in the Oriental style and decorated with intricate ornaments. Did someone drop it or plant it on purpose? I took it in my hand. How could it not be here? I decided to appropriate it. Putting the amulet in my pants pocket, I went back into the room, closed the door at the ankle, and laid down on the couch again. After a while, sleep watched me. I woke up to a chilling, howling human scream. Yes, carrying everything from the street. A gunshot rang out. I rushed down the stairs, shoving my feet into my boots as I went. Hardly had I run out of the house when a flock of bats flew over my head, flapping their wings loudly. I turned my head and saw a vague shadow flicker in the distance. A group of hastily dressed people were crowding about 50 meters away from the house. As I got closer, I saw the body of a confused man lying on the ground. He was already dying. His voice was weakened. He kept mumbling something in an unknown language. Then he stretched out and froze forever, turning into a heap of ugly flesh on the soft earth around him and wiping the body anew. The footprints of some giant animal were clearly visible. 2 men covered the body with leather and dragged it onto a stretcher. The mistress standing nearby wrapped a woolen shawl around the body, then said something quietly to Jack, who held the billet, the gun, and slowly walked toward the house. No one paid the slightest attention to me. The people around me seemed to understand perfectly well what the matter was, and to them there was nothing unusual about it. I put my revolver behind my belt and walked to the door of the study. I had a feeling that there was someone inside. I cautiously opened the door and saw a female figure on the sofa, illuminated by the bright moonlight. Hearing the door creak open, the woman turned around. God, I even flinched. It was Cindy. Illuminated by the moonlight, beautiful face, the same white dress. The girl walked up to me without saying a word. She took my hand and led me to the couch. From surprise, I lost the ability to resist. I woke up from a hot, long kiss. I carefully moved away from the young body. "I'm sorry, I can't. I have a wife." I mumbled a little audibly. "She's not here. I want you." She covered my face with kisses, trying to pull my jacket off my shoulders. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a prude or a slacker. I've had women in my life, young and not so young, but I've been married. And most importantly, I love my wife. I couldn't go back on the vows I made at the altar. To be together for better or for worse, to die on the same day. I'm sorry, Cindy. I can't. You're very beautiful, but I'm not free. I said something else, trying not to offend the girl by saying no. Finally, she quieted down and just sat there, pressed against me. "Are you looking for a collection or something?" Suddenly she asked, fixing her bangs. Pani Jadwiga burned it, but a small part of it survived. "I'll show you." She was silent for a moment, as if hesitating to tell me something. "I'll show you where it's hidden, but you'll take me away from here," she said firmly. "Where from?" the surprise. I asked a stupid question. "I don't care where. As long as it's away from here. I can't stay here any longer." The lady grabbed me from Mr. Corbin. He's in his 70s. He's already paid for me in gold. Cindy suddenly sobbed. "I'd rather drown myself. What's life like that? She's your aunt." I shuddered at her sobs. She's not my aunt. I'm her brother's adopted daughter. He took me from the orphanage 6 years ago, kept me here until he died. Now my aunt wants to make a profit off me. Cindy grabbed my hand. Take me out of here. I'm gonna be lost anyway. She fixed her bangs again with that familiar motion. I'd seen it before, but I couldn't remember anyone who'd ever done it. In fact, Cindy reminded me of someone. But who? I looked at the beautiful face. I stroked the silks, the clean hair. It gave off an odor, the faint scent of drunken jasmine. It was as if I could read her mind. Take me away, my love. Don't leave me, she whispered. I've waited so long for you, love and moons. The scent of jasmine. The girl lit the lantern and stood up. Come, I'll show you the collection. I stood in a damp cellar, and before me on a hastily made fairy tale of rotten floorboards, on a pedestal stood a coffin covered with mold and bits of clay. It was evident that it had long rested in the cemetery soil. Once made of oak planks, it was now a pitiful sight. The lid was pulled off, and well-preserved human remains came into view. In some places the bones were shattered, but on the whole the skeleton was well preserved. The skull with long hair, fangs, and empty eye sockets. Next to the skeleton lay a sword. But even without this attribute, it was clear to me that it was a warrior. But that's not what struck me. On the chest of your corpse on a leather lanyard hung an amulet, exactly like the one I found on the stairs 2 hours earlier. I don't know why, but I was suddenly overcome with terror. I lost the ability to think and move. A creature with brightly glowing eyes was approaching me. It came so close that I could hear its angry breathing. Suddenly it grabbed me with its paws and teeth, batted at my neck. I felt the pain of the bite, and a warm trickle of blood ran down my chest. I snapped out of my fake nightmare. The sun was shining outside the window. On the table was a white towel-covered breakfast of toasted slices of white bread, butter, and a pot of hot coffee. Honestly, I didn't yet realize where was dream and where was reality. I remembered well how the jar and I had gone down to the basement, how she had shown me the straw-covered boxes that held the cloth-wrapped wooden figures. Even at first glance, they were worth a fabulous amount of money. Then Cindy left, and I fell into this nightmare. I even leaned in. It was so natural. Well, it was time to leave. Just how to get the collection and the pit. The door shrieked and Jack came in. "Good morning, Baron," he said respectfully. "Cindy has told me everything." "Help her, Baron. She's a good girl. She doesn't belong here." Jack wished with his lips and continued, "The wagon is ready for you. I've put the boxes of dolls in there and covered them with hay. Cindy will be waiting for us at the fork behind the old cemetery. It's not far from here. Mrs. Jadwiga has gone to Kuma's and won't be back until tonight. I'll take you straight to the station. Hurry up, Baron. In the meantime, I don't think there'll be any trouble." Sebastian took a sip of wine, clearly savoring the drink. "How soon we solve our case." Sebastian looked at Lisa. "What's the holdup?" "As soon as the object appears in the city, we do it right away. Don't worry, everything will be honorable and noble. The mosquito won't poke its nose in." The man sitting opposite Sebastian looked expressively at the empty bottle of Take Down the Satrap. "That's the only way to do it." Sebastian wrinkled his nose. "Is he drunk or what?" He nodded to the sex man. "Some kind of inadequate." But he didn't say anything out loud. The interlocutor was drinking a second bottle. After all, he was pestering about revolution and terror. They were starting to pay attention. Sebastian put the envelope with the money under the tablecloth and bowed out. "I'm waiting for the result on the street." Lisa cried. She suddenly felt sorry for her husband. But then she remembered the money and Sebastian, and the sadness receded. Ah, if only it could be done without killing. Sebastian jumped into the span and cradled his mistress's left body. Lisa sighed and kissed his cheek. "I love you so much, sweetheart." An hour later we pulled up to the old cemetery, pulling in on both sides of the road. Judging by the general desolation, the gnarled monuments and broken hailstones, No one had been buried in the cemetery for a long time. There was silence all around. Not even the sound of the wind could be heard. The place was definitely haunted. I wandered at night between the mossy gravestones with inscriptions in an unknown language, which no one could read. I even got a little creepy. But I realized it wasn't ghosts I had to fear, it was living people. Come on, Cindy. You picked a good place to meet. Jack looked at me with a frown, as if he'd read my mind in that abandoned January cemetery. There are such people in this land, and no one can read the inscriptions, not even the Braves. The inscriptions are badly erased. I marveled at the knowledge of the village man. I'd heard something about them. They fought a long battle with the Slavs who came to this land from the west. The wars lasted for 100 years until these people assimilated with the invaders, but they preserved their language and their culture to this day. At the edge of the cemetery, Cindy was waiting for us, dressed in high-lifted traveling gowns. Seeing our carriage, she deftly jumped on it and smiled dreamily. Her thoughts were already in St. Petersburg. I did not share her optimism, if only because horsemen appeared from the turn. When they saw us, they quickly headed in our direction. It was immediately clear to me that we would not be able to escape. 4 armed guards of the county police, led by an associate. "Wait, who are they?" shouted the eldest, holding his horse. "People from out of town. We're going to the station." Did I answer as politely as possible? "We have documents." The ranger kept a suspicious look on my face. "Kuzmik, look, there's a girl." A young voice sounded behind me. I turned around. One of the guards had pulled Cindy's handkerchief off, and her blonde hair fell over her shoulders. "She's all right," the young one laughed. "Give me the papers." The guard leaned toward me and held out his hand. At that moment, there was an indignant shout from Cindy. The guard got off his horse and shamelessly searched for the girl to the loud laughter of his associates. "I thought you were the police, but you're a gang of guards." Disappointedly stretched out I. "Are you literate?" The town officer swung to hit me with a whip, but did not have time. The revolver struck the shot. The policeman dropped the whip and grabbed his arm. I ran up to him and pulled him off his horse, put the revolver to his temple. "Come on, hurry up," I shouted to his troops. Guns on the ground. Fearfully sticking their Glizzen Abbas at me, the soldiers slowly got off their horses. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. I shot into the air. The horses bucked fearfully and rushed down the road. "You're finished," came the voice of the older man. "He'll rot at the penal colony." I did not deny myself the pleasure of striking him in the teeth with the handle of my revolver. Now he was busy, spitting out splinters of teeth with Jack's blood. "Gather the guns in the cart," I commanded the valet. "And don't shake. You'll be all right." While Jack panted, Cindy hopped off the wagon, quickly picked up the rifles that had been thrown on the road, then stood there as if thinking about something and quickly kicked the young guard in the butt with the toe of her boot. He screamed and bent almost to the ground. Apparently, he was collecting eggs on the road. The officer, clamping his bloody mouth, found it necessary to keep silent. "Now let's get out of here." I jumped into the cart and nodded to Jack. "Pull the cart." Cheerfully jammed, body over the potholes, leaving behind defeated troops of the land police. Evenings. Soon the station was to appear. We drove through the forest and into a less well-maintained inn. The sound of hoof stomping reached my ear. A gendarme cavalry troop came out of the forest. Yes, these are not the Zemstvo police. They do it without blinking an eye, I thought, and that's a lot of military men today. Skokov in front of the detachment. The staff captain raised his hand. The horsemen surrounded us. "Who are they?" The commander spoke calmly, feeling behind him strength. "We were on a visit. We're going to the station now." I spoke calmly too. The officer looked at his watch and suddenly said, "It's 2:00 before the train, so you'll make it in time." Marlowe, I looked carefully at the staff captain. Holy shit, it's Joe. Our bunks were next to each other at the junior college. "This is the meeting. Job jumped off his horse and came up to me. "Well, hello, devils." We hugged. "Can I have a word with you?" I touched my classmate's sleeve. We stepped aside, whispered a little. Then Lieutenant Redchinsky himself gave the order. "Take the men and go back. There are policemen somewhere on the road. Pick them up and take their weapons from the cart. Smith and Joseph, stay with me. We'll escort Mr. Marlowe to the station." The train arrived at St. Petersburg. Early in the morning, I hired a coachman and a loader. They moved the crates of dolls to the cart. Cindy and I got into the aisle and drove to my house. I decided not to keep anything from Lisa, knowing her kind nature. She must be sympathetic to the poor girl's plight. When I entered the apartment, my favorite wife did not meet me in the kitchen. Only the maid Wendy came up to meet me. She confusedly told me that Lisa had gone away a week ago with some young man and his brother. Well, I knew her brother. He was forgiving. 2 meetings were enough for me to turn him down. But who was the other one? From what the maid told me, Lisa ran away with my money. Not a great loss, but I left Cindy in Wendy's care. I sat down on the couch and thought about what to do next. I'd only been gone a little over a week. I'd already lost my wife and my money. Ugh, money. To hell with the wife. Here's the rub. What could have happened in such a short time that she had ruthlessly stepped over my love? For me, there was no alternative. Kick her to the curb. But still, what influenced her? Was it princely hubris or an unsatisfied vanity? I took out a bottle of cognac and poured myself a full shot. How is it our way? Drown your sorrows in cognac. But I didn't have time to drink it. There was a loud knock at the door. In a minute, Wendy brought into my office a young military-looking officer in a blue uniform, handed me a sealed Surguta packet. While I read, the sub-lieutenant stood silently and looked at me faithfully. "Everything is clear." I folded the paper. "Mr. Captain, the carriage is waiting downstairs. I've been ordered to bring you here at once." The officer clicked his heels kindly. "Give me 15 minutes. I put the package on the table. I dressed quickly, shook the dust off my epaulets, and strapped on my checker. "Wendy, take care of Cindy. I need to get away." I put on my cap. Ah, it sounded behind me. Cindy, eyes wide open, rushed in surprise at me dressed in an officer's uniform in full parade. I grinned in satisfaction. Damn it, it's nice to make young ladies lose their minds at the sight of you. His Excellency is about to perceive. The young adjutant grumbled and swung the door open. I walked across the soft carpet to a large oak table, at which sat a not yet old state general in a dress uniform. "Come in, Stephen." He waved his hand cordially, showing me to a soft leather sofa, in front of which stood a service table. The adjutant filled shot glasses and moved a plate with an appetizer. "I won't tell you what this is all about. You'll find out soon enough." Vaughn grinned slyly. "In an hour we are waiting for the sovereign." I even choked up cognac stuck in my throat. "Who is waiting?" I asked through a cough. "Your Majesty." His Excellency patted me on the back. "Let's have a drink and get on our way." The state councilor corrected a strand of hair that had fallen on his face with a familiar gesture. I even flinched. I couldn't stop thinking about Cindy as we walked down the long corridor. I was happy for her, if I wasn't mistaken. That girl was going to do well. A chamber footman ushered us into a huge hall. A burly, bearded man rose from behind a large miscellaneous table. Emperor Alexander II came out to meet us. We stopped and bowed our heads. Your Majesty started to share, but the Emperor stopped him with a gesture. "Why the unnecessary words, gentlemen? Tell me, Joseph, have you thought about my proposal?" The Emperor's voice was soft, but in it you could feel the hidden strength of a man who left the whole of Europe trembling. "Yes, my lord, I agree." Dennis looked faithfully into the Emperor's eyes. The Emperor nodded with satisfaction. "And you, Baron?" I didn't realize at first which raven we were talking about, except for the Emperor and us here. There was no one else in the hall. "He doesn't know yet." "Your Majesty," smiled Dennis. He was not in Street Petersburg. Alexander II looked at me with a smile. 3 days ago, I granted your father nobility and the title of Baron for his invaluable help in building the Siberian Railroad. So you are now a second-generation Baron. The Emperor and Denis laughed. I want to appoint you Deputy Chief of the Palace Police, the Emperor continued, and looked at my companion. That's his deputy. I didn't think for a long time. I agree. Well, then congratulations on the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The Emperor sat down at the table. Gentlemen, I give you a month to organize the department. Tonight I dined at a place not on the Moika. To tell you the truth, I didn't like the bohemian bustle of restaurants, but this evening I wanted to be among people. Loneliness was weighing me down. I didn't risk taking the whole with me. It looked very provincial. Knowing the morals of our unglamorous young ladies, I did not want to expose a nice girl to their ridicule. I was in euphoria from the events of today. First, the news of Lisa's betrayal and escape, then the visit to the sovereign. A new appointment, a newly acquired title and rank, all of which would have made anyone's head spin. I was sitting alone at a table, away from the hustle and bustle of the world. When I heard a familiar laugh, I looked up. Almost opposite me was a group of young people, among whom my wife was laughing. Even from here, I could see how she was looking at the gentleman with the thin mustache under his nose. Around their table, the waiters were bustling. Wine. Bring wine. One of the girls shouted loudly. And that's when Lisa saw me. Her face turned white. Her companion intercepted her gaze and stared at me too. Everything was mixed up in his gaze. Fear, insolence, arrogance. Without getting up, he summoned the maitre d'. I always thought your restaurant was for a clean crowd. Deliberately loud so I could hear, he said. The noise at their table died down. Everyone stared at me in silence, expecting a scandal and my ignominious expulsion from the restauration. Yes, for the public that knows how to behave in a public place and with money, politely replied the meter man. Then what's this bullshit doing here? Sebastian nodded in my direction, and the maitre d' looked at me. I realized that Sebastian was known here, but it was the first time they had seen me. The maitre d' didn't know how to behave in such a case and didn't dare to do anything. I decided to come to his rescue. I rubbed my lips straight with a napkin, took my cane and approached a neighboring table. Don't worry, my good man. I'll take care of it in a moment. It's just a minor misunderstanding. I smiled affectionately at Sebastian. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Eliza turn even more pale with fear, clutching the Lezginka in her chair. I turned to my wife. It seems to me that you have lost track of time. It's time to get ready to go home. There's a carriage waiting for us at the entrance. Sebastian jumped up. Lisa isn't going anywhere. I looked at my lover in amazement. My soul. Who is that boy in my voice? Only a fool could fail to sense the obvious sneer. Lisa shook her head, unable to utter a word. I would challenge you to a duel. You bastard. Sebastian was seething with rage. But you're not a nobleman, so get out of here. He grabbed me by the lapel of my jacket, seriously intending to throw me out of this noble establishment. 2 young Shegolevs, who were sitting at the table, came up to help him. Here I realized that it was time to act. I sharply hit Sebastian with my knee in the groin, and while he mooed in pain, he raked his privates into a heap. I dropped the cane and with 2 palms hit him in the ears. It's the kind of blow that bursts eardrums. The pain is unbelievable. Sebastian even forgot from the pain. But that wasn't enough for me. I hit him in the jaw with my right hand. Sebastian was thrown up, and he flew into a corner, picking his way into a pile of empty tables. I turned to his companions. The young men were already seated and looking at me fearfully. It looked like this was the first time they had seen such a fight. I picked up my cane, glad I didn't need my sword. Lisa, I'm waiting, I said to my wife. It's time to go. She silently got up and walked out. I slipped the maitre d' $5 for material and moral damage. He nodded understandingly, tucking the money into his breast pocket. I followed Lisa out the door. I didn't want to talk to that lying bastard at all. But it was a matter of principle. As long as she's my wife, she should be home. I'll throw her out. When will I finally decide what to do with her? In the morning, a policeman came and took me to the courthouse. The elderly judge took a long look at me and wrapped Sebastian screws around which Lohankin was fussing. And the lawyer then asked me the question, "Why did you beat up this gentleman?" I shrugged. The man attacked me in front of witnesses. I was only defending myself. The judge hummed and looked at the renamed Sebastian again. "But you don't have a scratch on you. Witnesses show that you beat him methodically." The judge menacingly, frowning his eyebrows, "Especially since this gentleman is a nobleman." "And you knew that?" "Yes, I did." "And what does that mean? Is his blood a different color, or is he immortal?" The judge was beginning to annoy me. The judge opened his mouth to put the boar in his place, which was me. As the courtroom creaked with boots cleaned, an adjutant of the chief of the palace police entered. He unceremoniously approached the judge and whispered something in his ear. The judge seemed to deflate. He looked at me with a completely different look. It was a look of genuine paternal concern. "Well, Stephen, why didn't you just say so?" He even stood up. "Mr. Barron, I'm dropping all charges against you. You are free to go." I stood up, turned around, and without looking at Mr. Sebastian, walked towards the exit. You should have seen the look on his face that very day. I brought the hole where they fight. They looked at each other in silence for a long time. Finally, a tear ran down Joseph's cheek. "Daddy!" The girl screamed and threw herself into her father's arms. What else can be added? Kinship is kinship. For years, Joseph was sure that his only daughter died in childbirth. I left the office without saying anything. They had a lot to talk about. A month later, the sovereign granted the divorce. I rented an apartment for Lisa and tried to forget her. You can imagine her state of mind when she found out she'd lost her nobility and title again. And the money, and her husband too. She tried to get back together with me, but as you can see, in vain. Betrayal is unforgivable. Lisa lived in Street Petersburg for a while, but then she sold her apartment and left. Her fate is unknown to me. Sebastian confused everything with the SRs and was soon shot by the police during an expropriation. Christopher Wyazemski lost at cards, so he was forced to sell the mortgaged estate. My father bought it and gave it to my mother as a reminder of her happy childhood. And I plunged into my work. I decided for myself, no more women. Enough. What else but trouble can you expect from them? I distanced myself from Cindy in every way possible. Excuse me, Cindy Joseph. Joseph officially recognized her as his daughter. She must have been hoping for something. But I made it very clear that I would not marry her under any circumstances. Cindy seemed to calm down. She was now selling a collection of Russian, and I hardly saw her. One evening in late November, I was sitting in my office and leafed through a fresh catalog, which I sent me from old memory my agent in Berlin. The doorbell rang, and Wendy announced that Cindy had come to pick up her things. A few minutes later, she entered my office. In her hands was one of the sculptures we had taken out of a young African man holding a jug. Cindy set it on the stone shelf. "This is a keepsake for you." Then she gaped at us for a moment. I shrugged, playing off indifference. Cindy stood for a moment longer and then suddenly asked if I could have something to keep as a souvenir. "Cindy, take anything you want. I love that girl, but I couldn't help myself. Principles, gentlemen." "Thank you, Stephen." Blushing, Wendy called out. The maid brought an open bottle of champagne and 2 tall flutes. "Let's have a drink." Cindy sat down on the edge of the couch and handed me the wine flute. I lightly touched the rim of her flute and in one fell swoop drank the contents with the last thing I saw. Before I passed out Cindy's satisfied face, I opened my eyes to my chest. Something was pressing. I lowered my head slightly, and in the light of the boss I saw my female head. While building on my hairy chest, Cindy cautiously peeked under the blanket. Both me and the girl were unclothed. I didn't realize anything about how I ended up in bed with her. She felt me moving and opened her eyes. You said yourself that I can take anything I want as a memento. So I took you. I wanted to say something, but she covered my mouth with a passionate kiss.